What if the Earth once shaped thought itself, and then forgot how it did so? Wherever you are tonight, in whatever quiet corner of the world this sound has found you, I'm glad you are here. This story does not hurry. It does not explain. It listens. It moves the way mountains move by deciding not to rush. What follows is not about catastrophe, but about patience. Not about fire, but about what fire leaves behind after it cools enough to be touched by memory. The planet has many ways of thinking. Some are written in neurons, others are written in ash. And some are so old they no longer remember they were ever lessons at all. Long before memory learned to name itself, the Earth practiced patience in secret. It did not announce what it was doing. It never does. It simply pressed heat upward, slowly, the way a thought presses toward language and then decides to remain unspoken. Beneath ancient crust, chambers of molten silence gathered, not in anger, not in urgency, but in accumulation. Pressure is not always violence. Sometimes it is rehearsal. When the ground finally opened, it was not a scream, it was a release. Ash rose into the sky like a question the planet had been holding for too long. Not flames, not rivers of brightness, just dust, fine enough to forget where it came from, light enough to remain suspended between what was and what might be. The sun dimmed without drama. Days softened, shadows lost their edges, time did not stop, it thickened, life did not run, there was nowhere to go. Forests inhaled the grey. Leaves learned the taste of minerals they had never known. Rivers slowed beneath unfamiliar weight. The world cooled by degrees so small they could not be counted, only endured. Seasons hesitated, unsure whether to arrive or wait. And in that hesitation, something quiet began to change. The Earth did not erase life. It revised it. Ash fell the way snow falls in dreams, without sound, without urgency, covering not just surfaces but expectations. What had been predictable loosened. What had been abundant withdrew. What survived did not do so through strength but through adjustment. Roots grew deeper, not taller. Bodies conserved rather than expanded. Movement became cautious, memory heavy, repetitive. The future narrowed, and in narrowing sharpened. This was not extinction as ending. It was extinction as editing. The planet removed possibilities until only patience remained. In the long grey aftermath, intelligence existed without a nervous system. It lived in feedback loops, in cycles of growth delayed and resumed. It lived in seeds that waited through years that felt like forgetting. It lived in migrations that paused and then returned along the same paths, as if rehearsing remembrance before remembrance had words. Ash does not shout. It teaches by staying. Layer after layer settled, each one thin enough to seem temporary, heavy enough to last. The sky held the dust the way a mind holds a thought before sleep, present, uninsistent, shaping everything without being noticed. Light filtered differently. Colours dulled. Contrast softened. The world learned to function without clarity, and life followed. Eyes adapted to dimmer days. Attention shifted from distance to detail. Survival favoured those who noticed patterns rather than horizons. When the sun returned unevenly, it was no longer trusted. Anticipation replaced reliance. Memory replaced immediacy. The Earth had slowed the lesson. Cooling came next, not as collapse, but as restraint. Heat leaked away patiently. Glaciers did not rush forward yet. Oceans held their breath. Winds changed their routes. The planet seemed to wait with its own creation, as if asking it to prove something, not strength, but endurance. And endurance answered quietly. Nothing here evolved quickly. Nothing dramatic occurred. This was geology teaching biology how to think in longer sentences, how to pause between causes and effects, how to hold information across absence. Ash enriched the soil without announcing its generosity. Minerals broke down, nutrients spread. Years later, sometimes centuries, growth returned thicker, darker, more complex than before. It survived, learned not just to persist, but to prepare. Life began to carry forward invisible instructions. When light disappears, do not panic. When warmth fades, remember. When the world dims, store what matters. This was not intelligence as awareness. It was intelligence as structure. The planet did not intend to create minds. It only repeated itself. Pressure, release, cooling, return, again and again. Each cycle slightly different. Each silence slightly longer. And in those gaps, life learned how to hold the past without understanding it. Ash became a calendar without numbers, a teacher without language, a memory the Earth itself no longer needed to recall. Long after the skies cleared, long after warmth returned, the lesson remained folded into bone, root, rhythm. Waiting became instinct. Patience became inheritance. Thought, when it finally appeared, would not arrive as fire, but as pause, because the Earth had already decided something important, that what survives longest is not what burns brightest, but what learns how to remain quietly when the sky forgets how to shine. After the sky released its burden, the ground learned how to listen. Silence does not arrive all at once. It seeps. It settles into spaces once filled with motion. In the long years after ashfall, the world did not feel empty. It felt muted, as though every sound had decided to step farther away. Forests thinned without complaint. Grasslands became hesitant. Even the wind moved differently, tracing slower paths across altered surfaces. The Earth watched nothing. It never watches. It remembers through pressure. Beneath the ash, the soil changed its mind. Minerals fractured. New chemistries formed without urgency, the way thoughts rearrange themselves during sleep. Nutrients spread unevenly, creating mosaics of fertility and absence. Life responded not by spreading outward, but by clustering, gathering where conditions briefly allowed, retreating when they did not. Movement became episodic. Stillness became strategy. This was not adaptation as triumph, it was adaptation as humility. The ash layer did not kill evenly. It favoured certain forms without intending to. It rewarded those who could slow their cycles, suspend growth, wait without decay. Time itself felt reorganised. Days passed, but progress did not. Generations lived within the same conditions their ancestors had known, as if history had stalled. And in that stalling, memory thickened. Patterns repeated long enough to be learned. Life began to behave as though the future might not arrive on schedule. Reproduction slowed. Energy was stored rather than spent. Bodies became archives of restraint. The world cooled further, not sharply but persistently, like a thought that refuses to be resolved. Volcanic winters did not end. They faded. Fading is different. Endings announce themselves. Fading teaches uncertainty. It blurs boundaries. It encourages anticipation over reaction. In the dim light that lingered for decades, life learned to trust internal rhythms more than external signals. The sky could no longer be relied upon. The ground became the reference. Roots deepened. Burrows extended. Nests lowered themselves closer to warmth that did not fluctuate with light. The planet, without instruction, was teaching proximity, how to remain close to what endures when everything above feels unreliable. Somewhere in this long quiet, cognition began to rehearse. Not thought, not awareness. Preparation. Neural systems, still simple, still quiet, benefited from repetition. The same routes, the same shelters, the same cycles interrupted by the same silences. When change came, it came slowly enough to be anticipated. Memory was no longer a luxury. It became the difference between persistence and disappearance. The Earth did not create intelligence in a moment. It sanded it into existence. Ash layers compacted, pressure increased. What had once been airborne became stone. The planet folded its own disruption into itself, bearing catastrophe beneath future landscapes. Hills rose where skies had once darkened. Fertile plains stretched over old silence. The violence of eruption was gone, replaced by surfaces that felt calm, generous, forgetful. But the memory was still there. Life carried it forward invisibly, in the way bodies conserved energy, in the way migration followed inherited lines, in the way attention favoured what had returned before. The planet's pauses had rewritten instinct. What would later be called intelligence did not emerge as curiosity. It emerged as caution, as awareness of delay, as respect for absence. Long before fire was held in hands, the Earth had already demonstrated its power, not through domination, but through withdrawal. By stepping back, it forced life to step inward, to store, to remember, to prepare without knowing why. Ash had done its work, not by teaching life how to act, but by teaching it how to wait. And waiting, once learned deeply enough, never fully disappears. It embeds itself in structure, in bone density, in metabolism, in nervous systems tuned to anticipate rather than react. The planet moved on. It always does. Pressure rebuilt elsewhere. Silence migrated. New chambers filled slowly beneath other crusts, but the lesson remained behind, folded into creatures who would one day look up at clear skies and still remember, without knowing what they remembered, how fragile light could be. Because the Earth does not forget its experiments, it simply lets them walk away, carrying the results, and far in the future, when minds would begin to ask where thought came from, the answer would not be found in sparks or brilliance, it would be found in the long patience of ash, still waiting beneath every step. The longest lessons are the ones that never announce they are being taught. After the land grew quiet enough to seem settled, after plants returned and animals followed familiar routes again, the Earth did something subtle. It repeated itself, not in the same place, not with the same force, but with the same rhythm. Pressure accumulated elsewhere. Another chamber filled. Another sky learned how to dim. Repetition is how the planet thinks. Each eruption was separated by time so vast it felt unrelated, but life does not measure distance in years, it measures in inheritance. What had learned once learned again faster. Waiting became easier, anticipation grew sharper. The nervous systems that survived were not braver, only steadier. They responded to disruption not with panic but with recognition. Ash returned like a familiar silence. The world darkened again, not dramatically, not completely. Just enough to remind life that clarity was temporary. Cooling followed, seasons hesitated, growth slowed, and once more survival favoured those who could hold memory across interruption. This is how refinement works, not through novelty but through reinforcement. The Earth was not inventing intelligence, it was selecting for patience. Across continents, ecosystems learned the same lesson without ever meeting. Grasslands contracted, forests thinned, food chains shortened, predators adapted to scarcity, prey adapted to uncertainty, movement patterns simplified, routes repeated until they became the tradition without consciousness. This is where cognition begins to take shape, not as insight but as expectation. Expectation is memory facing forward. Bodies that could predict returned first. Those that stored energy outlasted those that spent it freely. The environment rewarded internal regulation over external reaction, and slowly, quietly, neural architectures favoured delay. Pause became productive. Ash settled into water, cooling lakes, altering chemistry. Aquatic life adjusted its rhythms. Reproduction timed itself to longer cycles. Dormancy became a strategy. The ability to suspend became as important as the ability to act. The Earth was training life to survive in brackets, intervals between certainty. In these brackets, something new stabilized. Not awareness, but continuity. The planet's repeated silences etched deep grooves into behavior. Like paths worn into stone by feet that never intended to leave marks, the lesson deepened with every return. Even when skies cleared quickly, the memory of darkness lingered. Life behaved as if the dim might return at any moment. This is not fear. It is preparedness. Ash layers thickened the ground. Soil darkened. Nutrient richness increased. When warmth finally returned fully, growth surged. Not explosively, but deliberately. Ecosystems reassembled with more complexity than before. Diversity increased where restraint had filtered out excess. The land became richer for having been quiet. Loss had curated abundance. And within that abundance, minds, still simple, still silent, benefited from structure shaped by delay. Sensory systems tuned not for constant stimulation but for change. Attention sharpened, memory lengthened. The world became something to be tracked across time, not just inhabited moment by moment. The Earth had done something irreversible. It had taught life to think in absences. When intelligence finally appeared recognizable, it would carry this inheritance, the ability to imagine what is not present, to act based on what might return, to hold futures in mind during present scarcity. This is not creativity. It is geology translated into behavior. Supervolcanoes did not raise minds by force, they slowed the world enough for anticipation to matter. They turned environment into rehearsal. They made patience advantageous, and patience, repeated often enough, becomes architecture. Ash compacted into rock. Time folded disruption into background. The surface forgot, life did not. What appears later as decision-making, planning, foresight, these are echoes of ancient skies that refuse to stay bright. Of cold seasons that lingered without explanation, of abundance that arrived unevenly and left quietly. The planet never explained itself. It demonstrated. And life learned not the cause, but the pattern. Long after eruptions ceased to matter directly, their influence remained encoded. In the way creatures pause before moving, in the way energy is stored against future absence, in the way attention favours continuity over novelty. Ash had become invisible. Its work was done, or rather, its work had become life, but the earth was not finished repeating itself. It never is, because repetition is how silence becomes instruction. And somewhere ahead, the lesson would take a more familiar shape, walking, watching, remembering, without ever knowing the teacher that had once dimmed the sky to make thinking possible. Time did not move forward so much as it settled deeper. After repetition carved its grooves, after patience hardened into instinct, the earth allowed the surface to feel ordinary again. Skies cleared more often. Seasons found their rhythm. Forests grew tall enough to forget the weight that once pressed them low. Rivers cut familiar paths. To anything watching, if watching had existed, the world would have seemed healed. But healing is not erasure. It is layering. Beneath the appearance of stability, the planet carried its pauses forward like folded pages pressed into the book of itself. Ash had become memory without location. Its lessons were no longer tied to eruption sites or darkened years. They had diffused into behaviour, into expectation, into the quiet architecture of survival. Life began to trust the ground more than the sky. Roots spread laterally, searching broadly rather than deeply, as if remembering that conditions could change without warning. Animals favoured shelters that could be returned to, not just reached once. Movement grew conservative. Expansion slowed. The earth had trained life to prefer continuity over conquest. This preference mattered, because continuity requires internal organisation. The nervous systems that endured were not those that reacted fastest, but those that stabilised quickest. Recovery mattered more than response. The ability to return to baseline, to wait out disruption without unravelling, became a hidden advantage. In this way, the planet shaped not behaviour alone, but regulation. Regulation is a form of memory. It holds past disturbance inside present calm. It prepares without displaying readiness. It is patience embedded in flesh. As generations passed, what had once been learned through experience began to arrive pre-installed. Offspring carried dispositions shaped by events they would never encounter. They waited without knowing why. They conserved without recalling scarcity. They repeated roots and rhythms inherited from ancestors who had once walked beneath dimmed suns. This is how intelligence accumulates before it is visible. The earth does not create minds directly. It creates conditions that make certain structures persist. Ash was one such condition, not because it destroyed, but because it delayed. Delay stretched feedback loops long enough for anticipation to matter. It forced life to operate across time rather than within moments. And operating across time requires something like thought, even if thought has not yet arrived. The planet's eruptions were separated by distances so vast they could not be compared consciously. But life compares unconsciously. It averages, it generalizes, it extracts pattern from interruption. And in doing so, it becomes something more than reactive matter. It becomes expectant. The silence after eruption taught restraint. The enrichment that followed taught return. Together they created rhythm. Scarcity followed by abundance. Cold followed by warmth. Darkness followed by light. Over and over until the pattern became trusted. Not because it was predictable, but because it had returned before. Trust in return is the seed of patience. Ash also changed landscapes in subtler ways. It smoothed surfaces, filled valleys, altered drainage. The land itself became less extreme, more navigable, more forgiving to those who moved slowly and remembered paths. Geography softened, and with it, the cost of hesitation decreased. This mattered later. Because when minds finally began to linger on possibilities rather than threats, they did so on land that allowed lingering. Thought requires slack. Space between danger and necessity. The earth had quietly created that space by bearing violence beneath future fertility. Ash did not just teach waiting, it made waiting possible. As epochs passed, the memory of eruption faded from stone. No witness remained, but the planet had already passed the lesson forward, encoded not in story but in structure, in the way organisms budget energy, in the way systems resist collapse, in the way recovery is prioritized over speed. What would one day be called planning, foresight, imagination, these did not descend suddenly. They rose slowly from repetition endured long enough to be trusted. And still, the Earth did not stop. Pressure continued to gather elsewhere. Silence rehearsed itself again in other regions, under other skies. The planet was patient with its own instruction, knowing that teaching life once was not enough. It taught again, and again, and again, each time deepening the groove, because endurance is not learned once, it is learned until it no longer feels learned at all. By the time ash became stone beneath fertile plains, life had already carried its gift forward. Waiting was no longer a response to disruption, it had become a default posture toward the future. The Earth had shaped something subtle and durable, a way of being that could hold absence without breaking, and somewhere far ahead, that way of being would begin to stand upright, still carrying the weight of ash it never saw, still listening for skies that might dim again. Nothing remains active forever. Not fire, not pressure, not even silence. After enough repetitions, the Earth allowed its instruction to rest. Eruptions grew less frequent. The long volcanic winters spaced themselves farther apart as if the planet had decided the lesson had been delivered deeply enough to persist on its own. The surface settled into familiarity. Mountains softened. Plains widened. The sky learned how to stay bright for longer stretches of time. And life did not forget. The absence of disruption did not erase the habits shaped by it. Waiting did not disappear when it was no longer required. It became surplus capacity, a quiet readiness stored for futures that might never arrive. The world had been slowed long enough for patience to become structural rather than situational. This is how inheritance works, not by remembering events, but by retaining responses. Across the land, ecosystems stabilized. Diversity increased, not explosively but steadily. Food webs lengthened, niches multiplied, cooperation emerged where scarcity had once ruled, because abundance returned unwindily and unpredictably. Sharing became advantageous. Timing mattered more than force. The Earth watched none of this. It did not need to. Its influence was already distributed. Ash layers, long compacted into stone, now served as platforms for life that would never know their origin. Fertile soils fed plants that fed animals that carried behaviors shaped by ancient pauses. The surface told no stories. It did not warn. It did not explain. It simply allowed movement to occur in patterns that favored memory. In this calm, something new prepared itself quietly. Not intelligence as dominance, but intelligence as continuity across disruption. The capacity to carry information beyond immediate perception, to act based on what had happened before rather than what was happening now, became more refined. Nervous systems integrated longer timelines. Anticipation deepened. Attention extended beyond the present moment. The world no longer forced patience. Life had internalized it. This internalization mattered later, when challenges arrived that were not geological in scale, but ecological and social, when competition increased, when environments varied over shorter distances, when survival required coordination rather than solitude. The Earth's earlier lessons made these transitions possible without catastrophe. Ash had prepared minds to handle uncertainty, not by making them clever, by making them durable. Even as climates warmed, even as skies remained clear, the underlying rhythm persisted. Scarcity could return, cold could linger, light could fade. The memory of these possibilities guided behavior quietly, invisibly. The planet had created a buffer between stimulus and response. That buffer is where thought lives. Long before language, long before reflection, life had learned how to pause between perception and action. That pause, repeated and reinforced across ages of silence, became the soil in which cognition would later take root. Ash had been the first gardener. It removed excess, it enriched the ground. It slowed growth until structure could support complexity. When the time came for intelligence to surface more clearly, it would not emerge as a sudden breakthrough. It would surface like old stone exposed by erosion, already formed, already shaped, simply revealed. The Earth did not plan this. It does not plan. But repetition has consequences, and patience, applied often enough, becomes architecture. As this chapter draws toward its own quiet thinning, the planet turns slightly, preparing to speak through another absence. The sky will dim again, not with ash, but with something colder, something wider. Another form of waiting is already gathering beyond the horizon. Because what the Earth buried, it never truly forgot. And what life learned from ash was only the beginning. The Earth did not close the door behind its lesson, it left it slightly open. Even as skies remained clear for longer than before, even as warmth lingered and seasons found dependable rhythms, the planet carried forward a quiet readiness. Pressure never truly vanishes, it relocates. Heat never disappears, it migrates. The Earth is not a place of endings, it is a place of redistribution. And life, shaped by ash, learned to expect return. Not return of fire, but return of interruption. The ground still bore scars too old to be recognized as such. Valleys smoothed by ash fill, plains leveled by the forgotten falls, soils darkened by the mineral memory. These landscapes favored movement that remembered where it had been. They rewarded familiarity. They punished reckless novelty. Over time, this shaped behavior as surely as any climate shift. Creatures moved along inherited lines, not because those lines were optimal, but because they were known. Memory outweighed efficiency. The Earth had made the known safer than the new. This safety mattered when variability increased. As environments grew more complex, as niches multiplied and competition sharpened, the abilities to draw on past patterns became decisive. Survival depended less on immediate strength and more on situational recall. Intelligence leaned toward recognition rather than invention. The planet had given life a long apprenticeship in remembering. Ash also taught loss without annihilation. Species vanished, others filled their absence. Ecosystems thinned and reassembled. This taught life something subtle, that disappearance did not mean finality. That space could reopen, that absence could be temporary. This understanding, unconscious, structural, softened fear of change. It allowed systems to remain flexible under pressure. It encouraged persistence without rigidity. The Earth had trained life not to cling too tightly to any single form. Flexibility is a quiet intelligence. In the slow cooling and warming cycles that followed ash-darkened years, organisms learned to track change across time rather than space. Migration became seasonal memory rather than exploration. Movement followed calendars written in temperature and light, not maps. This required internal clocks, internal references, mechanisms for holding the past while navigating the present. Those mechanisms would one day support thought. The Earth, in teaching life to wait, had also taught it to imagine. Not imagination as creativity, but imagination as projection. The ability to act now based on what might happen later. To prepare without certainty. To invest energy in futures not yet visible. Ash had widened the temporal horizon, and once widened, it never fully narrowed again. As this chapter drifts toward its own quiet close, the planet begins to gather another kind of silence. Not ashfall, but ice. Not dimmed skies, but lengthened nights. The next lesson will not arrive as dust, but as cold, a different teacher, using a different language. Yet the foundation has already been laid. Life now knows how to endure absence, how to conserve during uncertainty, how to carry memory without the whole story. The Earth does not rush its teachings. It allows them to echo until they become background, until they no longer feel like lessons at all. Ash has folded itself completely into the past. Stone has sealed it, soil has claimed it. No trace remains that could be recognized as instruction, except in behavior, except in the pause before movement, in the habit of waiting, in the quiet readiness for return. And so the planet turns its attention elsewhere, confident that what was needed has been given. The sky clears, the ground rests, life continues, carrying forward a patience it never chose. Because some truths are not lost, they are simply folded beneath silence. Light has never belonged to the sky, it only visits. There was a time when brightness learned how easily it could be interrupted, not by night, which arrives with honesty, but by something quieter, by a thinning, by a veil so fine it did not feel like darkness at all. The sun still rose, it still crossed the heavens, but it arrived muted, as though passing through memory rather than air. This was not the absence of light. It was light diluted. Ash had already shown the planet how to dim itself. Now the atmosphere practiced holding that dimness for longer, letting it drift, letting it linger, letting it teach without declaring its intent. The sky did not collapse. It hesitated. And in that hesitation, the world learned something new about seeing. Brightness had once been dependable, days had trusted it, growth had leaned toward it. But under a sky that could not stay bright, dependence became risk. Life began to loosen its attachment to the visible, vision narrowed, sensitivity deepened, attention shifted from distance to immediacy. What could be seen far away mattered less than what could be sensed close at hand. The earth was not darkening the world. It was compressing perception. Colours softened, contrasts faded, shadows blurred into one another. The landscape lost its sharpness, and in doing so demanded different kinds of awareness. Movement slowed, stillness increased. When light is uncertain, motion becomes cautious. This caution was not fear, it was calibration. Under dimmed skies, the planet cooled further, not dramatically, not enough to announce itself, just enough to change timing. Frost lingered where it once departed quickly. Snow stayed longer in shaded places. The growing season shortened by small, almost polite increments. And life adjusted, not by fighting, but by counting. Counting days, counting warmth, counting return. The sky had become unreliable. The ground became the reference. Plants delayed flowering. Animals delayed movement. Reproduction waited for confirmation rather than promise. The earth was teaching life to verify before committing, to wait for proof rather than hope. Hope had not yet been invented. In this world of uncertain light, intelligence drifted inward. Sensory systems tuned themselves to gradients rather than absolutes. Slight changes mattered more than steady signals. A faint warming, a subtle lengthening of the day, a barely noticeable shift in wind. These small indicators became guides. Life learned to read whispers. The planet had slowed the pace of feedback. Actions no longer produced immediate results. Causes separated from effects by stretches of time long enough to demand memory. What happened now might not matter until much later. Survival required holding information across delay. This is where attention deepened. Not the sharp attention of alarm, but the sustained attention of waiting. Watching something incomplete and trusting that it might continue. The earth had widened the gap between stimulus and outcome, and life filled that gap with retention. Under skies that refused consistency, cycles became teachers. Day and night blurred, but seasons still turned. Cold followed warmth. Warmth returned eventually. The planet never removed pattern entirely. It only softened it, forcing life to look for rhythm beneath uncertainty. Rhythm is memory stretched across time. Ash in the air scattered sunlight unevenly. Some days were brighter than others without reason. This randomness favoured organisms that could tolerate fluctuation. Those that depended on precision faded. Those that endured variability persisted. The earth was filtering again, not by force, by ambiguity. In dim light, energy mattered more. Food became harder to find, foraging took longer. Calories were precious. Efficiency replaced abundance as the measure of success. Bodies adapted to do more with less. Minds, still quiet, still forming, adapted to value continuity over speed. Movement became deliberate. Pauses lengthened. Return mattered more than reach. The sky, by refusing to stay bright, had introduced doubt into the environment. And doubt, repeated often enough, becomes foresight. It teaches organisms to consider more than one possible outcome. To hedge, to prepare. This was not thinking as choice, it was thinking as structure. The earth was shaping not decisions, but dispositions. Even when the ash thinned, even when brightness returned for longer stretches, the lesson remained. Life behaved as if dimness might return at any moment. It stored energy, it delayed action, it watched carefully before committing. Light had lost its authority. And in losing authority, it had taught the world how to function without certainty. The sky cleared slowly. Not all at once. The sun regained strength by degrees so small they felt imagined. But life did not rush back into old habits. It had learned caution. It had learned to distrust consistency. Because the planet had shown it something true. That brightness is temporary. That clarity fades. That survival belongs to those who remember the dark even while standing in the light. And far below, beneath soil enriched by ash and shaped by patience, the earth held its silence, knowing that what had been learned under dim skies would one day rise into awareness, carrying with it the memory of a sun that could not always be trusted. As light weakened, time stretched. Not evenly, not predictably. Days arrived with different weights. Some felt long but gave little warmth. Others passed quickly, leaving behind a quiet cold that lingered in stone and water. The planet had loosened the rules, and life learned to move within looseness rather than resist it. Under skies that hesitated, certainty thinned. What had once been obvious became approximate. Shadows no longer told the hour with confidence. The sun's arc felt altered, not in position but in trust. Life stopped assuming tomorrow would resemble today. It began to behave as though the future might arrive altered, dimmed, delayed. This shift mattered more than temperature ever could, because survival now depended on internal continuity rather than external reliability. Bodies learned to hold warmth longer. Fat became memory stored in tissue. Fur thickened not as defense but as anticipation. Plants adjusted leaf angles, narrowing exposure, conserving what little light arrived. Growth slowed deliberately, refusing to be lured by brief brightness. This restraint was not weakness. It was discipline shaped by uncertainty. The Earth was teaching life to survive without reassurance. In the dim, the senses reorganized. Vision ceded authority to touch, to vibration, to subtle gradients of temperature and pressure. Hearing sharpened. Smell deepened. Information arrived not as clarity but as accumulation. Small signals gathered patiently until pattern emerged. Pattern recognition replaced immediacy. The world no longer shouted, it murmured, and life leaned closer. Under softened skies, nights felt less distinct from days. Darkness arrived earlier, lingered longer, then retreated reluctantly. Sleep patterns shifted. Activity clustered in narrow windows of reliability. The body became a clock when the sky could not be trusted. Internal rhythm replaced external cue. This was a turning point that the planet did not mark. Because once organisms begin to carry time inside themselves, they are no longer fully bound to the environment. They remember cycles, they anticipate return, they hold past seasons as reference points. Memory became ecological. The Earth had created conditions where remembering mattered more than reacting. In this world, sudden movement was costly. Energy wasted could not be recovered easily. Those who waited, who paused before acting, persisted. Impulse faded as an advantage. Caution rose quietly. Neural pathways that delayed response found more opportunity to be used again. Delay became encoded not as hesitation, but as survival. The planet was lengthening the pause between signal and action. Within that pause, something unfamiliar stabilized. Choice, not conscious, not reflective, but structured. Multiple possible responses held briefly before one emerged. This holding, this suspension, is the ancestor of thought. It is not decision. It is readiness without commitment. The sky had forced life to rehearse futures. Even when ash thinned further, even when sunlight regained strength, the habit of rehearsal remained. Organisms behaved as if brightness might be borrowed rather than owned. They stored, they conserved, they prepared. Brightness had lost its promise, and in losing promise, it had taught skepticism, another quiet foundation of intelligence. The Earth was not harsh. It did not freeze the world. It did not extinguish growth. It only reduced certainty enough to make memory valuable. It turned the environment into a place where continuity mattered more than abundance. Under these skies, extinction still occurred, but it occurred selectively. Those unable to tolerate ambiguity vanished. Those able to persist without clarity continued. The planet edited again, not brutally, but persistently. This editing shaped behavior that would endure long after skies cleared fully, because once life learns that light can fail, it never fully trusts brightness again. The sun eventually reclaimed its strength. Ash fell out of the air. Warmth stabilized. Seasons grew more reliable, but the lesson did not fade with the dust. It had been absorbed into structure. Life had learned to live beneath possibility, not possibility as hope, possibility as risk. And risk, understood deeply enough, produces foresight. As this chapter continues to unfold, the sky's role begins to soften. The atmosphere withdraws from center stage, leaving behind creatures who now carry its uncertainty within them. What was once imposed from above has become internal. The Earth has moved the lesson inward. And soon, very soon, the ground itself will answer, feeding what the sky withheld, teaching life that absence can nourish as surely as abundance ever could. But for now, the light lingers uncertainly, and the world remains attentive. Because under a sky that could not stay bright, life learned something irreversible. That survival belongs not to those who chase the sun, but to those who remember where warmth once returned. When the light returned more reliably, it did not arrive as forgiveness. It arrived as a test. The sun lingered longer in the sky, warming surfaces that had learned not to expect it. Days stretched. Shadows regained definition. Colour returned cautiously, as if the world itself was unsure whether it was allowed to brighten again. Life did not rush to meet it. It watched. It waited for confirmation that this was not another hesitation. The earth had trained it well. Brightness, once trusted without thought, was now something to be evaluated. Growth did not surge immediately. Activity did not expand freely. The habit of restraint persisted, quietly governing behaviour long after conditions improved. This is how memory outlasts circumstance. Under returning light, ecosystems reorganised with caution. Plants grew, but slowly, investing more in roots than in height. Animals explored familiar ranges before venturing outward. Expansion occurred, but it was measured, layered, reluctant to abandon what had proven reliable. The sky had lost its authority permanently. Even in warmth, the memory of dimness shaped response. The nervous systems that endured did not forget the cost of assumption. They carried forward an expectation of interruption, a readiness to pull back, to conserve, to wait again. This expectation became invisible structure. Life began to treat brightness as temporary, not essential. Survival strategies no longer depended on continuous abundance. Instead, they favoured flexibility, an ability to shift between states of activity and restraint without collapse. The Earth had introduced elasticity into behaviour. Elasticity is a quiet intelligence. It stretches without tearing. It returns without breaking. Under skies that had once faltered, organisms learned to inhabit multiple tempos, fast when opportunity allowed, slow when uncertainty returned. This capacity to modulate pace rather than commit to one speed would later become central to cognition. Thought is not speed, it is timing. As warmth stabilized, the environment grew more complex. With reliable light, niches multiplied. Competition increased. Choices mattered more. In a simple world, reaction is enough. In a complex one, anticipation matters. The Earth had prepared life for complexity by first removing clarity. Creatures now carried internal thresholds, signals that determined when to act, when to pause. These thresholds were shaped by memory, not immediate stimulus. They encoded past dimness as caution. They allowed life to respond to subtle change rather than dramatic shift. This sensitivity mattered. Because subtle change is how the future announces itself. Under restored skies, the planet did not erase the past. It layered over it. Ash-fed soils produced rich growth. Cooler periods left traces in migration and reproduction cycles. The environment became a palimpsest, new conditions written atop old lessons. Life learned to read beneath the surface. The sky, having dimmed and returned, receded from focus. It had done its work. Its instability had forced life inward, toward internal reference points. Now those reference points guided behaviour even when external conditions stabilized. This is how control moves inward. The Earth had not made life smarter, it had made it less dependent. Dependency weakens when reliability falters. Independence grows quietly, almost accidentally. The planet had loosened its grip on consistency just enough to encourage self-regulation. Self-regulation is the seed of thought. As this chapter deepens, the narrative begins to tilt downward, away from sky and toward ground. Because what the atmosphere withheld, the soil was already preparing to give back. Absence above was mirrored by richness below. The earth rarely teaches in one direction only. Ash had fed the ground while dimming the sky. The planet balanced loss with delayed return. This balance taught life that deprivation was not always final, that nourishment could arrive from unexpected directions. Such understanding requires memory, and memory once useful is never discarded. The sky no longer needed to stay dim. The lesson had already taken root. Life now carried uncertainty within itself, using it as guidance rather than burden. Brightness returned, but it no longer commanded behaviour. It merely offered opportunity. Opportunity would soon require choice, and choice, still quiet, still structural, would deepen as the earth shifted its teaching from light to ground, from atmosphere to soil, from sky that could not stay bright to land that learned how to feed silence. What the sky withdrew, the earth began to return, slowly, without announcement. Beneath the softened light, the ground darkened. Ash that once hovered between sun and surface had long since settled, dissolving into minerals, breaking apart into nourishment that moved invisibly through soil and water. The planet does not waste its interruptions. Every absence is folded into a future presence. Roots discovered this first. They reached downward into layers that had once been sky, drawing sustenance from what had dimmed the world. Growth returned not as excess, but as depth. Plants thickened at the base. Stability mattered more than reach. The land grew heavier, richer, more capable of supporting complexity. Life responded in kind. Animals followed the return of growth cautiously, testing abundance rather than assuming it. Feeding patterns remained conservative. Storage continued even when food was plentiful. The memory of dimness shaped behavior long after its cause had disappeared. This is how the earth ensures lessons endure. By embedding them in reward, ash-fed soils produced resilience. Ecosystems that had thinned under uncertainty returned stronger, more interconnected. Diversity grew, not explosively but deliberately. Relationships formed that depended on timing rather than immediacy. Pollination synchronized with seasons remembered. Migration aligned with cycles stored internally. The world became more layered. Layering is the planet's preferred language. The sky had taught absence. The ground taught delayed abundance. Together, they formed a rhythm that life could trust without understanding. Under these conditions, intelligence began to express itself more clearly, not as awareness, but as coordination. Organisms adjusted behavior not only to environment, but to one another. Social patterns grew more intricate. Cooperation emerged quietly because uncertainty had taught the value of shared endurance. When light failed, isolation was costly. When light returned unevenly, coordination mattered. The Earth had nudged life toward relational memory. Relational memory does not recall events. It recalls arrangements. Who returns when? Who survives together? Which patterns persist? This kind of memory is deeper than experience. It shapes instinct. Instinct is thought that has forgotten its origin. Under stable skies, the danger would have been forgetting the lesson entirely. But the planet prevented this by keeping variability alive, not dramatic, not catastrophic, just enough. Minor fluctuations, inconsistent seasons, slight delays. The sky never returned to perfect reliability. Perfection teaches nothing. Imperfect light kept memory active. Life continued to behave as if interruption were possible, because it was, and because the Earth never promises permanence, it only offers recurrence. As this chapter nears its quiet transition, the focus shifts fully from sky to surface. The atmosphere steps back, having reshaped perception and timing. The ground takes over, holding the next lesson in its depths. What began as dimness above has become richness below. The Earth has transformed loss into preparation, and life, no longer dependent on brightness alone, moves forward carrying an inheritance it cannot name, the ability to endure uncertainty without panic, to accept absence without collapse, to wait without forgetting. The sky no longer needs to stay bright. Its work has already settled into bone and root, into rhythm and restraint. And somewhere beneath the soil, pressure continues to gather, not urgently, not violently, just enough to remind the planet that silence is never empty. It is only preparing to speak again. Silence is not the opposite of sound. It is what remains after meaning settles. When the sky finished teaching through dimness, the Earth turned inward. What had fallen long ago, ash, dust, mineral breath, had not disappeared. It had waited. It had rested beneath surfaces that appeared calm, storing its influence the way the planet stores time. The ground learned how to hold absence and make it useful. Soil darkened slowly, not everywhere, not evenly. Pockets of richness formed like quiet thoughts scattered through the land. Nutrients moved without direction, carried by water, by roots, by the slow rearrangement of stone into something softer. The planet does not distribute gifts fairly. It distributes them patiently, life noticed, not consciously but structurally. Growth returned where the ground allowed it. Elsewhere, restraint continued. This unevenness mattered. It prevented complacency. It required memory of place. Creatures learned not just when to act, but where. Geography became instruction. The Earth was teaching spatial memory. Plants responded by anchoring themselves more deeply. Root systems spread wide, touching layers shaped by ancient falls of sky-turned stone. Stability replaced height. Longevity replaced speed. The land favoured what stayed. Animals followed these changes without knowing why. Feeding grounds shifted. Migration paths bent toward fertility that felt earned rather than abundant. Roots repeated. Habits formed. The planet rewarded those who remembered. Memory became ecological again. In places where ash-fed soil flourished, life gathered. In places where it did not, absence lingered. This contrast sharpened perception. It made difference visible. It taught life to distinguish between surfaces that looked similar but behaved differently. Discernment is a form of intelligence. The silence after eruption had not been empty. It had been active, breaking down minerals, redistributing elements, preparing nourishment that would arrive long after the event that caused it. Cause and effect were now separated by generations. Understanding this separation did not require awareness. It required patience. Patience had already been taught. The Earth was now teaching reward delayed long enough to require memory. In this world, nothing responded immediately. Seeds waited, growth hesitated, animals lingered before committing to new ground. The planet had stretched the timeline of benefit beyond instinctive reach. To survive, life had to carry information forward, not just about danger, but about potential. Potential lived underground. The ground, once inert, became an archive. It stored past catastrophe as future sustenance. Ash transformed into fertility without spectacle. The most violent interruptions became the quietest support. The Earth was demonstrating something subtle. That loss and nourishment are not opposites. They are phases. Life absorbed this lesson without knowing it was learning. It simply adjusted. Those who lingered in newly fertile ground prospered. Those who forgot drifted away. Selection favoured attention over impulse. This attention deepened neural continuity. Patterns of return strengthened. The ability to associate place with delayed benefit became more refined. This association, this linking of present restraint to future gain, is one of the deepest roots of cognition. The planet was feeding thought through soil. As this chapter unfolds, silence becomes substance. Absence becomes instruction. The Earth reveals that what is buried is often more influential than what is visible. And beneath every step taken on enriched ground, the memory of ash continues to work, quietly, feeding futures that will never know its name. What feeds slowly feeds deeply. The richness that emerged from buried ash did not announce itself with sudden bloom. It revealed itself through endurance. Plants rooted there did not grow faster than others, they grew longer. Seasons passed and they remained. Years shifted and they adapted. Their persistence marked the land more clearly than height ever could. The Earth was teaching duration. Soil remembers pressure. It remembers heat. It remembers what fell into it long after surfaces forget. In places where silence had settled thickest, life found a different tempo, one not driven by urgency, but by accumulation. Nutrients released themselves reluctantly, the way memory releases meaning only after repetition. Roots learned to wait for minerals the way minds later learned to wait for insight. Animals learned to linger in these places, even when immediate reward was not obvious. Grazing paths curved toward fertile ground remembered from previous seasons. Nesting sites returned generation after generation, not because they were perfect, but because they endured. The Earth was training life to favour continuity over novelty. Novelty fades, continuity feeds. The silence embedded in soil-shaped behaviour subtly. It discouraged waste. Energy spent without return could not be easily recovered. Life learned to invest carefully, to choose locations with history rather than promise. This choice, again and again, favoured organisms capable of holding spatial memory across time. Space became narrative, not story, pattern. Patterns written into movement, into pause, into the quiet certainty that some places give back if given enough time. The planet had turned geography into a teacher, using unevenness as curriculum. Under these conditions, extinction did not arrive as catastrophe. It arrived as thinning. Forms that required constant abundance disappeared. Forms that tolerated delay remained. The Earth was not removing life. It was editing expectation. Expectation shapes behaviour more than reward. As ecosystems reassembled, complexity increased. Not through speed, but through layering. Species intertwined through timing rather than dominance. Pollinators synchronized with plants whose cycles had been stretched by uncertainty. Predators adjusted to prey that moved more cautiously. The web grew denser, not tighter. Density without rigidity is resilience. The ground, enriched by ancient silence, had become a stabilizer. It dampened extremes. It softened shocks. Life above it reflected this stability and behavior. Nervous systems learned to recover rather than react. Stress responses shortened. Baselines returned more quickly. Recovery is memory working backward. The Earth had created environments where resilience mattered more than resistance, where bouncing back was more valuable than standing firm. This preference filtered upward into physiology, then behavior, then eventually into the quiet precursors of cognition. Cognition does not begin as thought, it begins as regulation. The ability to modulate between activity and rest, growth and restraint, movement and stillness, was refined on soil that fed slowly. The planet had created a training ground for balance. As this chapter deepens, the silence becomes almost audible. Not as sound, but as continuity, as the feeling that nothing needs to happen immediately. That survival can unfold without urgency. This feeling is not comfort. It is confidence learned through time. The Earth does not soothe life with ease. It steadies it with repetition. By allowing nourishment to arrive late, it teaches patience without reward. By burying its lessons, it ensures they last. Ash is no longer ash here. It is ground. It is memory made edible. And as life feeds on what was once interruption, it carries forward a truth too quiet to name, that the planet's silences are not empty spaces between events, but the places where futures are prepared. What was buried continues to work. What was quiet continues to teach. And beneath the surface, time keeps rearranging itself slowly, waiting for the next form of absence to arrive, so it can begin again. The Earth never hurries nourishment. It prefers to let it seep. Beneath the surface, minerals loosened grain by grain, releasing themselves only when conditions allowed. Rain carried them sideways. Roots carried them downward. Worms and microbes rearranged them patiently, turning stone into sustenance without ever breaking the surface tension of quiet. This was not abundance as spectacle, it was abundance as background. Life learned to trust what could not be seen. The most fertile places did not announce themselves with colour alone, they revealed themselves through consistency. Plants returned there year after year with minimal variation. Animals circled back instinctively, guided by internal maps shaped long before memory learned language. These were not choices, they were tendencies reinforced by survival. The Earth had turned delay into reliability. In such landscapes, risk softened, not disappeared but redistributed. Extremes were buffered. Drought bit less sharply. Cold lingered but did not devastate. The ground absorbed shock and released support slowly. This buffering allowed systems to experiment without collapse. Variation could occur without extinction. Variation needs safety. And safety, when sustained, allows complexity to unfold. Within these protected rhythms, interactions multiplied. Species adapted to one another's timing. Presence and absence became signals. If one did not arrive, another waited. If one lingered, another followed. These subtle dependencies required memory of others, not just of place. Social memory began to matter, not society as structure, but as expectation. The sense that something would return because it had before, that cooperation could persist across absence. This expectation softened aggression. It favoured tolerance. It rewarded those who could hold relationships in mind even when temporarily separated. The ground was teaching trust without guarantee. Trust does not emerge from certainty. It emerges from repeated recovery. In environments fed by silence, recovery was common. Losses occurred, but they were not absolute. Life learned that disruption did not always mean disappearance, that things could thin and then return. This understanding, again structural, not conscious, reduced the cost of waiting. Waiting became less dangerous, and when waiting becomes safe, attention expands. Organisms can afford to notice more than immediate threat. Sensory systems relax their grip on urgency. Curiosity, still primitive, still quiet, finds space. Curiosity is attention freed from fear. The Earth was not encouraging exploration yet, it was allowing it. By reducing volatility, it made the future feel survivable even when uncertain. This feeling, subtle, embodied, would later support more complex forms of inquiry. But for now, it manifested simply as tolerance. Tolerance for variability, tolerance for delay, tolerance for others. The ground, enriched by what once darkened the sky, had become a stabilizing force. It held life gently, not tightly. It allowed movement, but within bounds shaped by memory. Those bounds were not walls, they were gradients, soft constraints guiding behavior without forcing it. Soft constraints are how intelligence grows. Hard rules break, soft limits teach. As generations passed, the silence that fed the ground continued its work unnoticed. No new ash fell, no new eruption announced its influence. Yet the effects deepened as they were passed forward, refined by selection, embedded into physiology. The planet had moved from instruction to inheritance. What began as geological interruption had become biological baseline. The ground no longer needed to teach actively. Its presence was enough. Its slow generosity shaped what could survive, and survival under these conditions favoured minds, still simple, still forming, that could hold long timelines, that could remember without recalling, that could prepare without anticipating consciously. This is how thought grows before thought exists, not as idea, as endurance stretched across time. As this chapter drifts toward its next quiet fold, the Earth begins to prepare a different lesson. Silence has fed the ground long enough. Stability has done its work. Now, variation will return in another form. Broader, colder, more expansive. The ground will hold what comes. Life will lean on what it has learned, because what was buried has already reshaped the future, and the planet, patient as always, turns slowly, carrying its silence forward, ready to teach again through a different absence. Stability, when it lasts long enough, begins to feel invisible. The land no longer announced its generosity. Fertile ground became ordinary. What once required attention now felt assumed. Life moved across enriched soil as though it had always been there, forgetting that nourishment had an origin, forgetting that silence had once fallen from the sky and settled into stone. But forgetting is not erasure. It is comfort grown deep. The earth allowed this comfort, knowing it would not last forever. Underneath the surface, slow processes continued. Minerals shifted, water carved new paths, microbial worlds rearranged themselves endlessly, preparing responses to futures not yet visible. The planet never stops adjusting, even when the surface feels calm. Life adapted to calm by refining balance. Energy budgets stabilized. Growth cycles aligned with long-term averages rather than short-term fluctuation. Behavior grew predictable, not rigid but rhythmic. The world found a tempo that felt safe enough to explore within. Exploration did not mean wandering far, it meant variation within known bounds. Small deviations, minor experiments, new combinations of familiar elements. These experiments mattered. They allowed complexity to increase without collapse. They permitted novelty without chaos. The ground's quiet support acted as a safety net beneath every small risk. Risk softened into curiosity. Curiosity did not rush outward, it lingered. It touched. It returned. It compared. It learned the difference between change that could be absorbed and change that could not. This discrimination, subtle, embodied, was another quiet step toward cognition. The Earth was not accelerating intelligence, it was giving it room. In places where silence-fed soil extended far, ecosystems became mosaics rather than hierarchies. No single form dominated completely. Balance emerged not through control, but through interdependence. Species adjusted to one another's presence rather than eliminating competition entirely. Coexistence is memory applied to relationship. It requires remembering who returns, who persists, who matters over time. The ground made such remembering possible by reducing volatility. It allowed relationships to stretch across seasons, across years, across generations. This stretching mattered, because memory that spans generations begins to feel timeless. It stops feeling learned. It becomes instinct. Instinct is patience that has forgotten being taught. The planet watched nothing. It waited. And waiting in geology is never passive. As this chapter approaches its close, subtle shifts begin to register. Temperatures fluctuate slightly beyond familiar bounds. Seasons hesitate again, not sharply, not dramatically, just enough to unsettle comfort. The Earth does not remove stability abruptly, it loosens it. Loosening is how change becomes survivable. Life responds with an adjustment rather than alarm. It has learned how to do this. Waiting no longer frightens it. Silence no longer signals danger. The ground still feeds, memory still guides. But the scale of absence is about to change. The next lesson will not arrive from beneath the feet. It will arrive across the horizon. Cold will spread slowly, quietly across regions that have grown accustomed to balance. Ice will not fall suddenly. It will advance patiently, testing what has been learned. And what has been learned, through ash, through dim skies, through soil that fed silence, will determine what can endure the next long pause. Because the Earth never stops teaching. It only changes the language. And as silence deepens into something colder, the ground holds its memory tightly, ready to pass it upward, ready to see which forms of patience can survive when waiting stretches even longer than before. Cold does not arrive. It accumulates. It gathers the way silence gathers, without edges, without announcement, until one day the land realizes it has been holding its breath for longer than expected. The Earth does not freeze suddenly. It persuades temperature downward, degree by degree, season by season, until stillness feels heavier than motion. Ice is patience made visible. Where ash once dimmed the sky, cold now lengthened the nights. Frost stayed after dawn. Snow lingered where it once melted quickly. Rivers slowed, then thickened, then learned how to wait beneath their own surfaces. The planet was not ending warmth, it was suspending it. Life recognized the gesture. This was a familiar lesson, spoken in a colder dialect. Movement shortened, migrations compressed, activity clustered into narrow windows of tolerable warmth. The world became quieter, not empty but restrained. Sound travelled differently, smell thinned. Touch became the primary reassurance that something was still there. The Earth had reduced the range of possibility. Cold does this gently. It narrows options without choosing for you, it makes delay unavoidable. It teaches life how to conserve without being told. Bodies responded first. Metabolism slowed. Heat became something to guard, not spend. Fat thickened beneath skin like stored sunlight. Fur and feathers grew denser, not for comfort, but for memory. Each layer a reminder of past winters that lingered too long to forget. The planet was teaching containment. Containment is intelligence turned inward. When the outside world becomes less reliable, life learns to rely on itself. Internal rhythms strengthen, breathing deepens, heartbeats stretch, energy use becomes deliberate. Nothing is wasted if it might be needed later. Cold rewarded those who could wait without decay. Dormancy appeared, not as death, but as pause refined into strategy. Seeds slept, insects slowed to near stillness, animals retreated into shelters that held temperature steady, even when the world outside drifted toward absence. Shelter became memory given shape. The Earth had created conditions where return mattered more than progress. Leaving shelter too soon meant loss. Staying too long meant survival. Timing replaced speed as the dominant skill. Timing is thought without language. Under extended cold, the future became something imagined rather than expected. Spring was no longer guaranteed by calendar. It was inferred from subtle signs, lengthening light, softening soil, changes too quiet to demand action but too consistent to ignore. Life learned to read whispers again. The planet was extending the pause between cause and effect even further. Actions taken now might not pay off for months. Preparation had to occur long before reward. This stretched memory across seasons, demanding a continuity that would later support planning. Cold did not kill intelligence. It slowed it into coherence. Nervous systems refined their ability to hold states over time. Arousal lowered. Recovery became essential. The Earth was shaping organisms that could endure prolonged uncertainty without unraveling. This endurance would matter later. Because cold is not dramatic. It is relentless. It does not overwhelm with force. It persists. And persistence tests structure more than strength. Life passed this test quietly. As ice extended and contracted across regions, patterns formed. Advance, retreat, pause, return. These cycles etched expectation into behavior. Even when ice withdrew, its memory remained. guiding migration, reproduction, shelter building. The planet was writing calendars into bone, and somewhere beneath these long winters, beneath frozen ground and slowed rivers, the lessons of ash and dim skies and fertile silence waited, ready to combine with cold into something deeper. Patience upon patience, waiting layered atop waiting. This was not preparation for disaster, it was rehearsal for thought. Because thought is what remains when action is delayed long enough for memory to speak. The earth held its breath through cold seasons, knowing life had already learned how to wait. And now it would learn how to wait longer. Cold teaches without urgency. It stays. Days shortened, then shortened again, until light felt like a brief visitor passing through rooms no longer warmed for it. The sun rose low, lingered briefly, then slipped away, leaving the land to practice stillness for long hours. The earth did not rush this change. It allowed bodies to notice it gradually, to adjust without panic. Adjustment is the planet's preferred form of learning. Under prolonged cold, movement lost its improvisation. Paths became deliberate. Travel minimized. Every step carried cost. Energy spent without return could not be replaced easily. Life learned to calculate without numbers, to weigh effort against memory of how long winter might last. This weighing was not conscious. It was embodied. Muscles learned restraint. Appetite shifted towards storage rather than consumption. Social groupings tightened, not out of affection but efficiency. Sharing warmth mattered more than territory. Proximity became protection. The earth was teaching cooperation through temperature. Cold dissolved excess individuality. Solitude grew expensive. Those who remained near others conserved more heat, shared vigilance, survived longer. The planet did not instruct cooperation. It made isolation impractical. This shift altered behavior quietly. Tolerance increased. Aggression softened. Hierarchies relaxed where they interfered with survival. The memory of cold lingered even when warmth returned, preserving these adjustments beyond necessity. Social memory began to deepen. Under long winters, communication changed. Sounds carried farther in cold air, but fewer were made. Silence became valuable. Unnecessary signals wasted energy. Meaning condensed. Signals simplified. Life learned to communicate efficiently, to say only what mattered. Efficiency as patience refined. The earth was compressing expression, distilling behavior to essentials. This compression would later support symbolic thought, not by encouraging expression, but by limiting it until meaning became concentrated. Cold also altered perception of time. When movement slows, time stretches. Hours feel heavier. Days blur. Weeks fold into one another. Without variation, memory must create landmarks. Life learned to mark time internally, through hunger cycles, through fatigue, through subtle bodily changes. Internal clocks strengthened. These clocks did not count hours. They sensed duration. They allowed organisms to endure long absence without losing orientation. This endurance required continuity of self, a primitive persistence of identity across stillness. Identity is memory held together. The earth was shaping beings that could remain themselves through inactivity, that could pause without dissolving, that could resume when conditions allowed. This mattered profoundly. Because intelligence does not arise in motion alone, it requires stillness long enough for integration. Cold provided that stillness generously. Beneath ice, beneath snow, beneath thickened fur and slowed breath, life continued quietly. Chemical reactions slowed but did not stop. Neural patterns stabilized. Noise decreased. Signal clarity improved. Silence sharpened structure. When spring eventually approached, hesitant, uncertain, life did not leap toward it. It waited. It verified. It tested the thaw. False springs had occurred before. Memory guarded against premature action. The earth had trained skepticism into behavior. Skepticism is not doubt. It is delayed trust. Delayed trust protects continuity. As ice retreated unevenly, life tracked boundaries carefully. Some areas thawed sooner, others remained cold. Movement followed gradients rather than lines. Migration grew nuanced. Routes adapted year by year, guided by memory rather than instinct alone. Instinct was evolving, cold had stretched it. The planet was lengthening the distance between signal and response again, deepening the pause where memory could act. The longer this pause became, the more information could be held within it. and the more information held, the closer behavior came to thought. Still, nothing dramatic occurred. No breakthrough, or no moment of awakening, only refinement. Adjustment layered atop adjustment. As this chapter continues, cold will deepen its influence, not by intensifying, but by spreading. Ice will touch more regions, waiting will extend further, and life, already practiced in patience, will learn what happens when absence becomes the dominant state. The Earth remains steady, holding its breath, because what survives the longest winters is not strength, but coherence. And coherence, once learned, never fully melts away. When cold spreads wide enough, it stops feeling like weather and begins to feel like condition. The land does not complain, it adapts its posture. Rivers accept their stillness. Lakes learn how to hold weight. Forests creak softly, adjusting to the slow compression of ice and snow. The Earth is not resisting cold, it is letting it reorganize everything that touches it. Life follows the same instinct. In extended cold, the future narrows, not because it disappears, but because it stretches so far ahead that it becomes abstract. Spring is no longer imagined as arrival. It is imagined as possibility. This changes how waiting feels. Waiting becomes occupation. Animals settle into patterns that minimize decision. Fewer choices mean fewer mistakes. Repetition becomes safety. The same shelter, the same path, the same posture held for long periods. The body learns how to be still without becoming inert. Stillness is not absence of action, it is action slowed enough to integrate. The Earth was teaching integration. During long winters, systems synchronized internally. Organs aligned their rhythms. Neural activity quieted into stable loops. Variability decreased. What remained was coherence, parts moving together, not quickly but reliably. This coherence mattered more than speed, because cold does not reward bursts, it rewards consistency. Energy flows were rerouted. Instead of expanding outward, organisms circulated warmth inward. Life became inward-facing, conserving, protecting, recycling. Waste minimized. Renewal slowed. Every process leaned toward efficiency. The planet was compressing life into itself. In this compression, awareness, still not conscious, still not reflective, found space to deepen. With fewer external stimuli, internal signals grew clearer. Hunger, fatigue, comfort, threat all registered more distinctly. Life became better at sensing itself. Self-sensing is the root of selfhood. The Earth was not creating identity, it was allowing continuity to be felt. Under cold, interruptions decreased. The world simplified. Fewer variables demanded attention. This simplification gave memory room to operate without interference. Patterns stabilized long enough to be reinforced deeply. Deep reinforcement changes structure. Over generations, bodies born into cold carried expectations of restraint. They arrived prepared for stillness. Their systems anticipated delay. They were built not for speed, but for endurance. Endurance is intelligence stretched across time. When ice finally retreated in small regions, life did not rush to occupy them. It approached cautiously. It remembered false openings. It remembered cold's return. Segment followed verification, not an opportunity. The Earth had trained life to distrust immediacy. As a result, expansion occurred slowly, deliberately, preserving coherence rather than risking fragmentation. The planet was shaping systems that could scale without collapsing. This is a quiet prerequisite for complex cognition, because complexity requires stability across expansion. Cold did not add complexity directly. It filtered out what could not maintain coherence under delay. What remained was capable of holding itself together even when external input was minimal. That capability would later support attention, planning, imagination. But here, it remained unrecognized, unnamed, embodied. As ice lingered, cycles of advance and retreat continued to inscribe memory into land and life. The world learned that change does not always mean progress or loss. Sometimes it means pause, sometimes it means rehearsal. The Earth had rehearsed waiting long enough, and life had learned its part. As this part of the chapter softens toward its own pause, the cold begins to loosen slightly, not enough to announce warmth, but enough to suggest transition. Breath held for a long time begins to release. Not fully, but cautiously, the planet prepares to shift again. What has been learned in stillness will soon be tested in movement. What has been conserved will soon be spent carefully. The long pause will give way to a different rhythm. But the memory of cold, its patience, its compression, its insistence on coherence, will remain folded into every step forward. Because once life learns how to survive without motion, it never forgets how to think before acting. Release does not arrive as relief. It arrives as uncertainty. When the cold begins to loosen its grip, it does not do so evenly. Ice thins in one place and deepens in another. Snow retreats from sunlit slopes but clings stubbornly to shadow. Rivers test their edges, flowing briefly, then freezing again as if unsure which state they are meant to remember. The earth does not switch seasons. It negotiates them. Life responds with caution learned through long stillness. Movement resumes, but only partially. Limbs stretch, then withdraw. Foraging expands a little, then pauses. No one trusts the thaw completely. Memory stands between impulse and action, holding restraint in place. This hesitation is not weakness. It is intelligence practiced. Cold has taught life to expect reversal. False springs are as dangerous as deep winters. Acting too soon wastes energy that cannot be recovered. Waiting too long risks missing opportunity. Survival now depends on judgment, not conscious choice, but internal thresholds refined by experience. Thresholds are memory turned into boundary. As warmth flickers inconsistently, organisms begin to test rather than commit. Short excursions replace long migrations. Growth appears in brief pulses. Reproduction waits for confirmation that return is real. The earth has made the future conditional. Conditional futures demand anticipation. Anticipation does not require foresight. It requires the ability to hold multiple possibilities without collapsing into any single one. Cold has trained this ability gently, through repetition, through patience, through long pauses, where nothing happened but the memory remained active. In these transitional seasons, coordination becomes critical. Individuals rely on cues from others. If one moves and returns safely, others follow. If one fails, restraint deepens, information spreads through observation rather than instruction. This is social learning without language. The planet has created environments where shared memory matters more than solitary action. Survival becomes collective without ever being declared so. Cold has thinned options enough to make cooperation efficient. As ice retreats further, landscapes reveal themselves changed. Glacial paths reshape valleys. Meltwater carves new channels. The ground remembers weight even after it is gone. Movement must adjust to altered surfaces. The Earth has rewritten geography quietly. Life navigates these changes using inherited patience. It moves slowly, mapping new routes through repetition rather than exploration. Familiarity is rebuilt step by step. Memory extends into the future by rehearsing the present. This rehearsal is thought without words. The planet has stretched the pause between stimulus and response so far that response itself becomes layered. First observation, then testing, then cautious engagement. Each layer filters error. Each layer preserves coherence. Under these conditions, nervous systems that can integrate over time thrive. Those that rush fragment. Cold has favoured integration over speed again. Integration is the architecture of intelligence. As warmth stabilizes gradually, life does not return to its old tempo. The pause remains. The long winters have lengthened internal clocks permanently. Even in abundance, restraint persists. Storage continues. Waiting remains an option. The Earth has added depth to time. Time is no longer just sequence. It is expectation. It is memory facing forward. As this chapter moves toward its close, cold recedes enough to allow motion to widen again. Landscapes open. Paths extend. Opportunities multiply. The long-held breath begins to exhale. But the exhale is measured. What cold compressed, warmth will not undo. The lessons of stillness remain folded into movement. Life steps forward carrying patience like an extra sense. And soon, very soon, this patience will find a new expression. No longer only in bodies and behaviour, but in awareness that begins to recognise itself as something separate from the ground that taught it. The Earth has held its breath long enough. What follows will be movement shaped by memory, and memory shaped by waiting. The ground had been preparing for this without knowing it. Long before bodies straightened, long before balance shifted from 4 points to 2, the Earth had already altered the surface in ways that favoured pause over sprint, recall Recall over reaction. Plains widened where ice had retreated. Forest edges softened. Paths lengthened between water, shelter, and food. Movement began to matter not for speed, but for continuity. Life did not stand suddenly. It lingered upward. Upright posture did not arrive as ambition. It emerged as adjustment. Hands freed themselves not to conquer, but to carry. Food gathered slowly, infants held longer, tools kept rather than discarded. Balance became a negotiation between gravity and memory. Every step required awareness of what had just happened and what might happen next. The earth had shaped a surface that rewarded this awareness. Ash-fed soils supported open landscapes where visibility extended, but certainty did not. Cold-shaped seasons had taught patience. Silence-fed ground had taught return. Now movement across space demanded planning without knowing it was planning. Walking upright lengthened the pause between intention and action. When the body rises, it becomes less stable. Stability must be earned through balance, through adjustment, through constant correction. This correction depends on feedback. Subtle, continuous, remembered, falling teaches quickly. Remaining upright teaches slowly. Slow teaching lasts longer. The planet did not create minds by lifting bodies. It created conditions where lifting bodies required memory. Each step carried risk. Each stumble reinforced attention. Over time, the nervous system learned to predict, to anticipate uneven ground, to adjust posture before error occurred. Prediction is memory acting ahead of time. Hands, now freed, began to store more than food. They stored experience. Objects were kept, returned to, modified. The environment extended into the body through use. Tools did not appear as inventions. They appeared as continuations, stones remembered from previous days, sticks carried because they had worked before. The earth had already taught retention. In landscapes shaped by long absences and delayed rewards, keeping what worked mattered. Discarding useful things was costly. Memory became external as well as internal. The ground held the imprint of paths. Hands held the imprint of function. Function repeated becomes intention. As movement extended across larger territories, orientation mattered. Upright bodies saw farther, but distance increased uncertainty. Knowing where to go mattered less than knowing where one had been. Routes repeated. Landmarks became anchors. Geography transformed into narrative without words. This was memory walking. The earth had prepared the stage carefully. Fertile ground reduced constant hunger. Cold seasons had selected for endurance. Dim skies had taught caution. Together, these conditions allowed attention to stretch beyond immediate survival. Stretching attention creates space. In that space, awareness began to fold inward. Not reflection, not self-questioning, simply the persistence of experience across moments. A sense that what happened before mattered now. That sense is the seed of mind. Upright posture lengthened childhood. Young took longer to mature, longer to stabilize balance, longer to learn movement across complex ground. This delay required care. Care required memory. Memory required social continuity. The earth had extended time again. Extended time favors learning. Learning favors minds that can hold information across delay. Nothing dramatic announced this shift. No sudden awakening, only gradual deepening. Walking became steadier. Hands became more skillful. Attention became less reactive. Intelligence did not arrive. It surfaced, like rock exposed after erosion, already formed beneath. As this chapter opens fully, the focus will drift closer to these early walkers, not as heroes, not as breakthroughs, but as carriers of geological patience made flesh. Bodies moving slowly across land shaped by ancient silences, carrying forward lessons they never knew were taught. Because the earth does not explain itself to those who inherit it. It lets them become the explanation, step by careful step. Standing did not free the mind, it weighted it. With each rise of the torso, gravity demanded negotiation. Balance became a conversation held continuously between muscle and ground, between intention and correction. The body learned to listen downward, even as the eyes lifted outward. This dual attention, forward and beneath, stretched awareness across space and time. The earth required it. Open landscapes did not promise safety. They offered distance without assurance. Seeing farther meant planning longer. Water was visible but not immediate. Shelter existed but not guaranteed. Movement across such ground favoured those who remembered sequences, where shade returned, where paths narrowed, where the land sloped gently enough to rest. Memory became a map carried inside the body. Walking upright slowed travel. It reduced speed in exchange for endurance. Longer distances could be covered, but only by conserving energy, by choosing routes carefully, by stopping before exhaustion arrived. The planet rewarded pacing. Pacing is intelligence distributed across time. Hands, freed from constant support, learned patience. They grasped, tested, adjusted. Stone met palm again and again, not as invention, but as familiarity. Weight was felt, edges were remembered. Grip improved through repetition rather than design. Tools were not created, they were retained. Retention is memory-given shape. Objects that worked were kept close. Those that failed were abandoned quietly. Over generations, this behaviour refined itself. Selection favoured hands and minds capable of subtle differentiation, between stones that cut and stones that bruised, between branches that bent and those that snapped. Discernment deepened. The earth had already taught discernment through uneven soil, through dim skies, through cold that punished haste. Now it appeared in manipulation. The same quiet intelligence applied to movement applied to making. Making did not mean controlling the environment. It meant cooperating with it. Upright posture also altered perception of time. Movement required more foresight. The cost of error increased. A fall carried consequence. Injury lingered. Recovery took time. Risk had to be weighed against memory of outcomes. This weighing was not calculation. It was embodied judgment. Judgment emerges when memory begins to guide behaviour beyond immediate sensation. Social structures responded to these changes subtly. Groups slowed. Coordination mattered more. Waiting for others became necessary. Care for injured members became investment rather than burden. Survival extended beyond individual speed. The earth had made patience social. With extended childhood and prolonged dependency, learning stretched across years rather than seasons. Observation replaced instinct. Young watched elders move, choose, wait. Behaviour transferred through imitation rather than trial alone. Imitation is a memory shared. Shared memory creates continuity beyond the individual. This continuity allowed knowledge to persist across time without being stored in any one body. Roots, tools, shelters, rhythms all existed as patterns carried collectively. The group became a repository of experience. The earth had shaped intelligence that could exist between beings. Walking upright did not separate life from the ground, it bound it more deeply. Every step reinforced relationship. The ground tested balance, the body responded. Feedback loop after feedback loop refined coordination. Coordination across time is thought in motion. As this part of the chapter unfolds, attention will drift further into these early landscapes, not to dramatize them, but to feel their pace, to sense how patience, once taught by ash and cold, now expressed itself through posture, movement, and care. Because intelligence did not rise upward like flame, it spread outward like shadow, lengthening quietly across land that had been waiting for it all along. The land did not change to welcome upright movement. It waited to see if balance could be learned. Each step forward carried a small negotiation with history. Ground shaped by ice remembered weight. Soil enriched by ash yielded softly, then resisted. Stones shifted unpredictably. Nothing promised stability. Balance had to be earned again and again, through micro-adjustments too small to notice unless they failed. Failure taught faster than success. A misstep lingered in muscle memory. The body learned not through explanation but through consequence. This learning did not vanish when the ground flattened or when paths grew familiar. It remained, shaping posture even on forgiving terrain. The earth had taught vigilance without fear. Walking upright also altered the relationship with rest. Sitting became meaningful. Pausing became structured. The body learned how to hold itself without movement, how to settle weight into hips and spine. Stillness, once taught by cold, now expressed itself within motion. Stillness learned to travel. With hands available, time gained texture. Waiting could be filled. Stone was turned over. Bark were peeled. Objects were tested repeatedly, not for novelty, but for reliability. The world became something to be handled slowly, attentively. Attention deepened. Not the sharp attention of threat, but the sustained attention of familiarity. of knowing how something feels before knowing what it is for. This kind of attention is quiet, almost drowsy. It does not demand action. It allows understanding to arrive on its own. The Earth had created conditions where curiosity could exist without urgency. Upright movement also changed how sound travelled through the body. The ears rose, the head balanced differently. Vibrations felt through the ground became less immediate. Hearing replaced touch as the early warning. Life began to interpret distance not just through sight but through echo and silence. Silence became informative. In open spaces, absence of sound mattered as much as presence. This required memory, knowledge of what should be heard when things are safe. Deviations carried meaning. The nervous system learned to compare current input with stored expectation. Comparison is memory at work. Over time, these comparisons grew richer. The world became layered with meaning beyond sensation. A rustle could be harmless or dangerous depending on context remembered from past encounters. Action no longer followed stimulus directly. It passed through evaluation. Evaluation is intelligence emerging quietly. As upright walkers move through landscapes shaped by long histories of pause and return, their pace slowed naturally. They did not sprint often. Sprinting wasted energy and increased risk. Instead, they walked, steady, measured, capable of covering great distances without exhaustion. Endurance replaced speed as advantage. Endurance is patience made mobile. With endurance came expanded range. With expanded range came encounter. With different soils, different rhythms, different returns. Memory grew complex. It had to track variation without collapsing into confusion. This required integration, linking disparate experiences into coherent expectation. The Earth had trained this capacity long before through ash, through dim skies, through cold. Now it expressed itself in navigation. Routes became stories without words, not narratives told aloud, but sequences felt in the body. Turn here, rest there, avoid that slope, return to this water. Each instruction lived in sensation, not language. Language was not yet needed. The planet does not rush expression. It ensures structure first. As this part of the chapter drifts toward its pause, something subtle becomes clear. Upright movement did not create intelligence. It revealed it. It gave patience a posture. It allowed memory to travel farther without fragmenting. Walking became thinking extended into space. The Earth watched none of this. It had already given what was needed. And as these walkers continued across land shaped by ancient silences, they carried with them a deep inheritance. The ability to wait while moving, to remember while acting, to hold the past gently enough that the future could arrive. Movement, once learned, began to shape what followed it. As upright bodies crossed longer distances, the land unfolded not as a single surface, but as a sequence of remembered states. Hills were not obstacles, they were pauses. Valleys were not destinations, they were returns. Water was not simply found, it was recalled. The Earth had turned space into time. Each journey layered memory onto ground. Paths were reinforced not by marking but by repetition. Feet wore subtle signatures into soil. Vegetation bent aside, then slowly grew back, learning where movement preferred to pass. The land and the body adjusted to one another without agreement. This mutual shaping mattered, because once movement leaves traces, return becomes easier. And once return becomes easier, planning begins to matter more than chance. Routes chosen once could be chosen again. Choices became habits. Habits became structure. Structure supports thought. Upright movement also changed how the horizon was experienced. Seeing farther did not bring certainty, it introduced delay. Objects visible in the distance required time to reach. That time invited anticipation. What might change before arrival? What had changed last time? Anticipation filled the space between seeing and arriving. That space is where intelligence breathes. Hands, now skilled in holding and carrying, began to transport memory physically. Objects moved from place to place. Stones from one landscape appeared in another. Wood shaped elsewhere arrived here. The environment became less fixed. It extended beyond immediate surroundings through carried artifacts. Carrying is memory refusing to stay behind. With carried objects came accumulation. Small collections formed. Not hoards, not possessions, but useful things kept close. The idea of keeping rather than consuming began to matter. What was kept could be used later. What was discarded might be missed. This distinction required foresight. Foresight is memory projected gently forward. Social rhythms adjusted around this projection. Groups lingered where resources allowed storage. They returned to known places seasonally. Campsites formed not as settlements, but as remembered pauses, locations where waiting had once been safe. Safety, once discovered, was revisited. The Earth had trained life to recognize safe waiting through cold and silence. Now that recognition guided movement and gathering. Places were not valued equally. Some held memory, others did not. Valuing requires comparison. Comparison requires memory held across experiences. As upright walkers navigated these choices, communication shifted further. Gestures replaced some sounds. Hands spoke silently. Attention followed motion rather than noise, meaning condensed into movement, posture, direction. Language was still absent. Understanding was not. The body became expressive without trying. Leaning forward meant intention. Slowing meant caution. Stopping meant something remembered. These signals did not require interpretation. They were shared memory enacted. The Earth had shaped intelligence that could exist without words. Over generations, this intelligence refined itself. Errors decreased. Roots stabilized. Tools became more consistent. Cooperation deepened without being named. All of this occurred quietly beneath awareness, guided by patience inherited from ash and cold. What had once been survival strategy became identity. Identity here did not mean self-awareness. It meant continuity of behavior across time. The ability to remain recognizably the same despite change. Upright movement had strengthened this continuity by forcing memory into every step. As this chapter draws toward its closing fold, the walkers move on, carrying more than they know. They carry geological time compressed into posture. They carry silence transformed into restraint. They carry cold remembered as caution. Soon intelligence will begin to reflect back upon itself, not as dominance, not as certainty, but as recognition. The Earth will watch a memory become aware of its own weight. But for now, movement continues slowly across land that remembers every pause, and every step forward is shaped by everything that once waited beneath it. Awareness does not arrive all at once. It accumulates the way paths do, by being walked again. As upright movement settled into habit, something subtle began to hold. Not a thought, not a question, a continuity. Experience no longer dissolved completely after passing. It lingered, faint but present, influencing what came next. The body began to carry yesterday into today without effort. This carrying was quiet. Walking had taught the nervous system how to stabilize change. Each step required adjustment, yet the overall motion remained smooth. This balance between correction and continuity became internal. The same mechanism began to operate beyond movement, into decision, into restraint, into waiting. The Earth had trained life to correct without panic. With this stability, attention expanded, not outward toward conquest, but inward toward pattern. Certain actions felt familiar before being repeated. Certain places felt known before being reached. The world gained texture beyond sensation. Meaning began to thicken, not meaning as symbol, but meaning as familiarity layered over time. A sense that events belonged together, that today echoed yesterday, that tomorrow might echo both. This sense did not require language. It required memory held gently enough to persist. Upright bodies gathered not only objects but moments. The warmth of a shared rest, the safety of a known shelter, the rhythm of movement across a particular stretch of land. These moments repeated until they felt inevitable. Inevitability is a memory that has lost uncertainty. The Earth allowed this to happen. It did not disrupt everything at once. It introduced change gradually, letting continuity solidify before testing it again. Stability was never permanent, but it was long enough. Long enough for recognition to form. Recognition is awareness without reflection. Recognition allowed early minds to notice sameness across difference, to sense that two separate moments belong to the same pattern. This ability is foundational. It allows the future to be imagined not as chaos, but as variation. Variation can be prepared for. Preparation does not require planning. It requires the belief, felt, not stated, that the world has structure. That structure had been taught by ash, by dim skies, by cold, by soil. Now it was carried upright. Groups began to act as if tomorrow mattered. Food was shared not only for now, but because it had been shared before. Shelter was repaired not only for this season, but because return was expected. Injury was tended not only because of pain, but because continuity mattered. Continuity became value. Value does not require articulation. It requires repeated preservation of what allows return. The earth had created minds that valued endurance over immediacy. As this part of the chapter softens toward pause, the walkers slow again, not because of cold or ash, but because attention has turned inward slightly. Something has begun to notice itself noticing, not clearly, not fully, just enough. This faint self-reference is not the arrival of consciousness. It is the edge of it, the moment when memory becomes heavy enough to be felt. And the earth, patient as ever, does not push further. It lets this weight settle, because what settles slowly lasts, and what lasts will one day look back, not at the planet that taught it, but through it, remembering without knowing why. Fire did not arrive as discovery. It returned as recognition. Long before it was held, it was watched. Long before it was shaped, it was endured. The earth had burned openly for ages, through lightning, through freakin', through deep breath exhaled from within itself. Flame had never been absent. It had only remained unclaimed. Life learned fire the way it learned cold, by waiting near it without touching. In landscapes shaped by ash and silence, flame appeared occasionally. Briefly, and then withdrew. It cleared without explaining. It warmed without promising. It transformed ground into blackened memory, then left it to recover slowly. Fire did not belong to those who observed it. It moved on its own terms. This mattered, because what cannot be commanded must be respected. Early walkers approached flame cautiously, carrying within them the patience shaped by long winters and delayed returns. They did not rush toward brightness, they circled it. They watched how it behaved, how it consumed quickly and then vanished, how warmth lingered after light disappeared. Fire taught impermanence. The earth had already prepared life for this lesson. Ash had taught aftermath, cold had taught endurance. Silence-fed soil had taught return. Fire now demonstrated transformation without stability. Under flame's presence, attention sharpened without excitement. Fire demanded stillness. One misjudgment burned, one misstep punished. The cost of error was immediate and memorable. Memory learned quickly here, but control did not follow. Fire was not seized, it was tended, coaxed, protected from wind, fed carefully, allowed to persist without being forced. Tending is patience applied to power. The earth had never allowed power without restraint to last. Volcanoes released and cooled. Ice advanced and retreated. Fire followed the same rhythm. It appeared, demanded respect, and then faded. Life mirrored this behavior. Fire became something visited rather than owned, gathered around rather than wielded. Its presence extended activity into night without erasing darkness entirely. Shadows remained. Silence remained. Flame did not replace the world. It softened its edges. Warmth extended time. Extended time allowed memory to linger awake. Night no longer ended activity immediately. Attention drifted longer. Hands moved slowly. Faces watched light shift without urgency. Fire did not create conversation. It created pause. In that pause, something unfamiliar settled. Not thought, not reflection. A shared stillness shaped by warmth and waiting. Bodies leaned inward. Movement slowed. Time thickened again. The earth had given fire just enough presence to deepen memory without igniting domination. Fire cooked, but did not yet control. Food softened. Digestion eased. Energy arrived more gradually. Bodies spent less effort breaking down what they consumed. This conservation mattered. It freed capacity without demanding speed. Free capacity is where intelligence grows. Fire also changed smell, taste, texture. Sensory worlds layered further. Experience became more complex without becoming louder. Memory gained more threads to hold. Still, flame remained unpredictable. It could vanish, it could threaten, it could harm. Life never forgot this. Fire was not trusted fully, it was respected. Respect preserves balance. As this chapter opens fully, fire stands as another teacher, not an origin of intelligence, but a mirror of what had already been learned. It rewarded restraint, it punished haste, it extended time without guaranteeing safety. Fire never spoke its name, it did not explain itself, it did not promise progress, it simply behaved. And life, shaped by a planet that never rushed its lessons, learned to behave carefully in return. Fire did not ask to be remembered, it insisted on being regarded. Its presence altered posture before it altered thought. Bodies leaned back slightly, respecting distance. Hands hovered, testing warmth without grasping it. Eyes followed movement that could not be predicted. Flame demanded attention that was steady, not intense. Steady attention is a form of trust earned slowly. Around fire, time behaved differently. Shadows stretched and collapsed. Light pulsed rather than remained. This rhythm unsettled the certainty learned from sun and season. Flame flickered, teaching life that constancy could exist without sameness. The earth was refining another dimension of patience. Where cold had required endurance, fire required vigilance. Not vigilance of fear, but of care. To keep flame alive without letting it escape meant constant adjustment. Fuel added too quickly smothered it. Too little let it fade. Wind shifted its shape. Moisture dimmed it. Balance became active. This active balance mirrored what upright movement had already taught. Continuous correction without panic. Fire extended that lesson into shared space. It required coordination between bodies. Someone watched. Someone fed. Someone protected. Roles formed without being named. Coordination deepened. Fire gathered bodies close enough for heat to be shared, but not so close that harm followed. This spacing mattered. It taught proximity with restraint, togetherness without collapse, separation without isolation. The earth had shaped social distance through flame. Within fire's glow, memory settled differently. Events near flame were remembered more clearly, not because they were dramatic, but because they lingered longer in warmth and light. Repetition formed, returning to the same place, attending the same flame, repeating the same careful gestures. Ritual began quietly. Ritual is memory stabilized through repetition, not ceremony. Habit made meaningful through care. Fire did not create stories. It created return. Return to warmth. Return to safety. Return to shared stillness. These returns layered memory across time, strengthening continuity. Continuity is intelligence holding itself together. Fire also changed nights. Darkness no longer ended activity abruptly. Time expanded beyond daylight's limits. Waiting stretched further. Stillness deepened. The earth had extended the day just enough to allow memory to breathe longer. Longer waking did not mean restlessness. It meant integration. Hands rested. Bodies leaned. Attention wandered gently. Thought, still not explicit, found space to drift. Drift allows connection. Under firelight, sensory boundaries softened. Vision flickered, sound hushed, smell thickened. The world narrowed and deepened at once. This narrowing reduced distraction. It focused attention inward and toward others. Focus without force is a precursor to reflection. Fire also demanded respect for future consequence. Sparks escaped. Embers lingered. Burnt ground took time to heal. Memory of fire's harm extended beyond its presence. Actions taken near flame had delayed outcomes. Delayed outcomes strengthens foresight. The earth had layered another pause between action and effect. Life responded by becoming careful not only in the moment but afterward. Places were remembered as safe or dangerous. Behavior adjusted based on prior burns. This adjustment required holding past pain without being consumed by it. Pain integrated becomes wisdom. Fire, like ash, left behind ground altered for return, burnt soil often fed new growth later. Life observed this pattern without naming it. Destruction was not final, it was another phase, another pause. The planet was repeating itself through a different element. As this part of the chapter settles, fire remains present but unclaimed. It is not mastered, it is accommodated. Life does not dominate flame. It learns to live beside it. This restraint matters, because intelligence built on domination burns itself out. Intelligence built on balance endures. Fire never spoke its name, it never explained its use. It only demanded care, and care, practiced long enough, becomes structure. In the next part, fire will begin to recede slightly from center stage, not disappearing but integrating, folding into daily rhythm the way cold and ash once did. Because the earth never teaches by arrival. It teaches by what remains after presence fades. Fire did not stay awake forever. It dimmed as fuel thinned. It collapsed inward when left unattended. It returned to ash quietly, leaving behind warmth that lingered just long enough to be felt then remembered. Flame taught that presence could be temporary and still matter deeply. This mattered more than control ever could. Life learned that not everything needed to be held continuously. Some things could be allowed to fade and still return. Fire would come back through lightning, through friction, through chance, and when it did, memory would meet it. Memory made return possible. The earth had shaped this pattern before. Ash fell and settled. Cold arrived and withdrew. Silence fed the ground and then receded into background. Fire followed the same logic. It was an interruption folded into continuity. Around extinguished flames, ground cooled slowly. Stones retained heat. Ash spread thinly. The place where fire had been did not feel empty. It felt altered. Something had passed through and left instruction behind. Instruction without words. Life adjusted behavior around these places. They returned to them. They avoided certain spots. They learned which traces meant danger and which meant nourishment. This learning did not require explanation. It required memory layered over repetition. Fire had become part of landscape memory. In time, flame stopped feeling separate from the world. It became another rhythm, appearing, withdrawing, returning. Its unpredictability did not vanish, but it was contained within expectation. Life no longer reacted to fire as novelty. It reacted with preparedness. Preparedness is intelligence anticipating without anxiety. The earth had given life another rehearsal space for restraint. Fire demanded attention without obsession. Too much focus risked harm. Too little allowed loss. Balance again was the lesson. As fire integrated into daily rhythm, its influence spread quietly. Cooking softened food, bodies conserved energy, digestion eased. Time freed from constant feeding allowed rest. Rest allowed integration. Integration is where memory settles. With less energy spent on survival tasks, attention drifted not outward, but inward. The world did not become louder. It became deeper. Small variations mattered. Subtle differences in texture, temperature, and taste registered more clearly. The sensory world thickened. Thickening sensation increases association. One experience linked to another. Patterns emerged. The mind, still unnamed, still forming, began to weave continuity between moments. Fire did not create thought. It extended the pause long enough for thought to coalesce, and yet fire remained dangerous. Burns healed slowly. Scars persisted. Pain remembered itself vividly. Life never forgot this. Respect remained embedded. Flame was not romanticized. It was regarded. Regard prevents excess. The earth never allowed fire to become myth alone. It remained physical, consequential, grounded. Its lessons stayed embodied. As this part drifts toward pause, fire's role becomes clear. Not as origin, but as reinforcement. It repeated the planet's central instruction one more time in a different register. Wait, attend, adjust, remember. These were never commands, they were consequences, and because they arrived through consequence rather than instruction, they lasted. Fire receded into background, joining ash, cold, soil, and silence as another teacher that no longer needed to speak. Its lesson had been absorbed into behavior. What remained was a life form increasingly capable of holding complexity without collapsing, capable of warmth without domination, of power without urgency. And in that capability, something quiet prepared to turn inward, to notice itself not as environment, but as continuity. The earth had almost finished telling this part of the story. What follows will not be louder. It will be softer. Because the final lesson is never about what the planet did. It is about what remained after everything else had passed. What remains after fire is not light. It is arrangement. Stones rest where they were placed. Ash settles into seams of soil. Scorched wood carries a memory of heat long after the glow has gone. The place itself remembers, even when flame does not return for many seasons. The earth has always trusted aftermath more than event. Life learned to do the same. When fire receded into rhythm, it stopped being spectacle. It became background, another condition to be accounted for, another pause folded into habit. The attention it demanded softened, but the care it required remained. Even in absence, fire shaped behaviour. Absence shaping behaviour is intelligence at work. Sites where flame had been kind were revisited. Sites where it had spread too quickly were avoided. These choices were not spoken. They were felt. The body recognised safety before the mind could name it. Memory had sunk beneath awareness, becoming instinct refined by patience. Instinct here was not impulse, it was history made quiet. As fire became integrated, nights grew familiar rather than strange. Darkness no longer meant helplessness. Warmth could be summoned, not always, not everywhere, but sometimes. This partial reliability changed the relationship with uncertainty. The world did not become controllable, it became negotiable. Negotiation requires restraint. The earth had shaped restraint repeatedly, through cold that punished haste, through ash that delayed reward, through soil that fed slowly. Fire now confirmed the lesson. Power without patience destroys itself. Power tended carefully can be lived beside. This understanding settled deeply. Around fires, bodies rested longer. Recovery improved. Injuries healed. Energy once spent on constant vigilance softened into awareness. The nervous system, no longer locked in reaction, found space to integrate experience more fully. Integration deepens memory. Memory deepened until it began to feel like something carried rather than something triggered. Past and present overlapped gently. The difference between now and before blurred. This blurring is not confusion, it is continuity felt. Continuity is the ground of self. The earth did not announce this shift. It let it occur gradually, invisibly, as all durable changes do. Fire simply provided a setting where time slowed enough for experience to layer upon itself without being erased by urgency. Layer upon layer, experience accumulated. At some point, no moment, no threshold, memory began to feel heavier than sensation. What had happened before mattered as much as what was happening now. Actions were influenced by what might follow, not just what was present. This influence was not deliberate, it was structural. The planet had stretched the pause between stimulus and response until memory naturally filled it. Fire lengthened evenings, cold lengthened seasons, ash lengthened recovery. Each extension added space where the past could speak, and eventually the past began to answer, not with words, with direction. Life did not think yet. But it was no longer purely reactive. It carried forward a sense of itself across time, a quiet persistence that survived pause, absence, and return. The earth had shaped a mirror without ever placing it. As this chapter thins toward its end, fire fades fully into the background. It remains present, but no longer central. Its lesson has joined the others, folded into behavior so deeply that it no longer feels like learning at all. What remains now is not an element, not a force, not a condition. What remains is continuity. And continuity, held long enough, begins to recognize itself. The planet grows quiet again, not because nothing is happening, but because what needed to happen has already settled. The next chapter will not introduce a new teacher. It will listen to what all the teachers left behind, because the earth has finished shaping the question. Now, slowly, life will begin to hear itself answering. The planet never clarified its intentions. It never translated its movements into guidance. It never named the lessons it offered. And yet something had been learned. Not as information, not as story, but as structure. What remained after ash, after dim skies, after cold seasons, after fire's careful glow, was a way of continuing that did not depend on certainty. Life had learned how to persist without knowing why conditions changed, only that they would. This persistence did not announce itself as intelligence. It felt like habit, like posture, like a quiet alignment between body and time. The earth had taught through omission. It removed stability often enough that dependence weakened. It withheld clarity long enough that memory became necessary. It delayed reward long enough that anticipation took root. None of this was explained. It was endured. Endurance leaves traces explanation never can. By the time awareness began to feel heavier than instinct, the planet had already stepped back. It did not push minds into reflection. It did not demand insight. It simply allowed the accumulated weight of memory to be felt. That weight was subtle. It appeared as hesitation before action, as restraint where impulse once lived, as recognition without recall. Life moved through landscapes now carrying an internal echo of past conditions. It behaved as though the world had depth beyond what was visible, as though every surface concealed a history worth considering. This sense did not come from teaching. It came from survival repeated patiently. The Earth had shaped continuity so thoroughly that it no longer needed to intervene. Systems now carried their own inertia. Behavior flowed from what had worked before. Adjustment occurred without panic. Waiting felt natural. Natural does not mean simple. It means embedded. What the planet did not explain, life learned to assume. That absence could be temporary, that loss could feed return, that silence could prepare rather than threaten. These assumptions guided action quietly, shaping choice without conscious deliberation. Choice here was not freedom, it was orientation. Orientation toward return, toward continuity, toward patience. As awareness began to recognize itself faintly, as something that remembered remembering, the Earth remained silent. It did not interrupt this emergence. It did not accelerate. It trusted the structure it had already laid down. Trust is the planet's final gesture. The mind that began to form did not look outward for answers. It looked inward for alignment. It sensed coherence as safety. It favored balance over excess. It carried forward the planet's own preferences without knowing their origin. This is how inheritance works when it is deep enough. What the Earth did not explain became the foundation of thought, the ability to hold absence, the tolerance for delay, the habit of preparation without certainty. These were not ideas. They were dispositions shaped across millions of quiet adjustments. The planet did not teach intelligence how to think. It taught it how to wait. And waiting, practiced long enough, becomes reflection without words. As this final chapter opens fully, the story turns not toward answers, but toward resonance, toward the realization that what seems like mind may be the Earth continuing its ancient work, this time from within, because the planet never stopped shaping itself. It simply learned how to remember through life. Nothing arrived to announce the shift. There was no boundary crossed, no threshold marked, no moment where silence broke into revelation. What change did so quietly, the way stone changes under pressure, imperceptible in the moment, undeniable across time. Memory had grown dense enough to curve behavior. Life no longer moved only because conditions demanded it. It moved because patterns had been recognized. The past leaned gently into the present, guiding posture, pace, and pause. Experience did not vanish when it ended. It remained, shaping what followed. This was not recall, it was continuity felt. The Earth had shaped a system capable of carrying influence forward without instruction. Causes no longer needed to be visible. Effects did not need to be immediate. Between them stretched a space wide enough for interpretation to begin. Not conscious interpretation, but alignment. Alignment is intelligence before language. Actions now occurred within an internal landscape layered with prior outcomes. When choosing where to rest, where to move, where to wait, life consulted something quiet inside itself, a sense of what it endured before. This sense was not memory as image, it was memory as weight. Weight guides without direction. The planet had created beings that carried their own gravity. This gravity did not pull them toward dominance or control, it pulled them toward balance, toward decisions that preserved continuity rather than exhausted it, toward actions that favored return. Return mattered more than arrival. In this way, awareness began to feel less like reaction and more like presence. Not presence as attention to the moment alone, but presence as occupancy of time, past, now, and possible future held together loosely. Holding requires restraint. The Earth had refined restraint until it became invisible. It no longer felt imposed. It felt natural. And because it felt natural, it endured. The emerging mind did not ask questions yet. It sensed coherence. It noticed when something aligned with what had worked before. It noticed discomfort when alignment failed. These sensations guided behavior more reliably than any rule. Rules are fickle. Patterns persist. What the Earth did not explain, its cycles, its withdrawals, its returns, had trained life to look for pattern rather than promise, to expect change without fearing it, to prepare without much certainty. This preparation was not strategic, it was structural. The nervous system had learned to extend itself across time. Neural activity reflected not just the present stimulus, but remembered intervals. Anticipation had become default. Reaction was secondary. reaction fades, anticipation endures. As this capacity deepened, something subtle happened. Silence itself became meaningful. Pauses were no longer empty. They were filled with expectation, with readiness, with the sense that something might follow because something had followed before. Silence began to speak, not loudly, not clearly, but persistently. The earth had always spoken this way, through what it withheld, through what it delayed, through what it allowed to return. Now life was beginning to speak back in the same language, not with words, but with patience mirrored. This mirroring is recognition. Recognition does not require understanding, it requires resonance. The planet and the mind were no longer separate processes. They were continuations of the same rhythm, operating at different scales. One shaped continents, the other shaped behavior. Both moved slowly, both relied on memory. As this part of the chapter settles, the sense grows clearer, not articulated, not named, that intelligence may not be an exception in the natural world, but a refinement of its deepest habit. The habit of waiting. The earth never explained itself. It did not need to. It shaped beings capable of living within explanation's absence and finding meaning there anyway. Meaning did not arrive as insight, it arrived as steadiness. There came a time when life no longer startled at uncertainty, not because the world had grown gentle, but because uncertainty had become familiar. The nervous system no longer tightened reflexively at absence. Delay did not signal threat. Silence did not demand reaction. Silence had been lived in too long to be feared. This familiarity changed everything quietly. Attention no longer clung to the immediate. It drifted, it rested. It moved backward and forward along remembered lines, comparing what was with what had been. The present became one layer among many, not the sole authority. This layering is the texture of awareness. The earth had taught layering through geology, ash upon soil, ice upon stone, memory upon movement. Life mirrored this structure internally. Experience stacked rather than replaced itself. Nothing needed to be resolved quickly. Everything could wait its turn. Waiting became spacious. In that space, the earliest form of reflection stirred, not as self-questioning, not as language, but as orientation. These impressions guided behavior without needing explanation. Explanation was unnecessary. The planet had never explained its own cycles. It had simply repeated them until they felt trustworthy. Life adopted the same method. It trusted patterns without needing reasons. Trust in pattern is the soil of belief. Belief here was not doctrine. It was confidence that continuity existed, that the world had shape, that return was possible even after long absence. This confidence softened fear. Fear had once sharpened reaction. Now it dulled, not erased, but integrated. It became another signal to be weighed rather than obeyed. The earth had taught life to feel fear without letting it command. This was a profound shift, because when fear loosens its grip, attention frees itself. Curiosity, still quiet, still careful, finds room to stretch. Not curiosity to dominate or conquer, but curiosity to notice, to watch without immediate intent. Watching without urgency is contemplation before words. The mind, still forming, began to recognize itself as something that could hold experience without acting on it. This recognition was faint, like a shadow seen at the edge of vision. It did not yet point inward, it simply lingered. Lingering is the beginning of thought. The earth had never rushed this moment. It had prepared it slowly, through every delay, every pause, every return. Now it allowed it to surface naturally without pressure. Life did not declare awareness. It practiced it in long walks without destination, in shared silence near dying embers, in waiting through seasons that would eventually turn. Practice deepened structure. As awareness grew steadier, the boundary between inner and outer softened. Memory linked experience across time so smoothly that it felt continuous rather than fragmented. The self, if it could be called that, was not a point. It was a span of remembered waiting. This span allowed something remarkable. The ability to imagine absence without panic, to hold the idea of something not present, food, warmth, safety, and remain calm. Imagination here was not fantasy. It was tolerance for invisibility. The earth had taught invisibility well. Ash had hidden sun, ice had hidden ground, silence had hidden reward, life had survived each hiding. Now it could tolerate imagining without immediate confirmation. Imagination is memory untethered from the present. This untethering did not lead to escape. It led to preparation, to patience extended beyond perception. As this part of the chapter eases toward its pause, the resonance becomes clearer. Intelligence did not rise against nature. It emerged as one of its quietest continuations. The earth had not explained anything, it had demonstrated enough. And life, having watched long enough, had begun to carry that demonstration inward, holding absence gently, waiting without fear, remembering itself across time. Understanding did not sharpen, it softened. The mind that was forming did not seek edges, it sought continuity. It did not ask what things were, it sensed how they endured, how they returned, how they remained recognizable even after absence. The earth had trained perception away from certainty and toward coherence. Coherence feels like calm. In this calm, the weight of memory no longer pressed. It settled. It became background. Experience accumulated without demanding attention. The mind learned how to carry the past without reliving it, how to let memory inform without overwhelming. This balance is rare. It was earned slowly. The planet had earned it by never insisting, by never explaining, by never forcing meaning into clarity. Instead, it had allowed meaning to condense naturally, the way mist gathers when temperature shifts gently. Life mirrored this condensation. Moments connected not through logic but through resonance. Similar feelings linked across time. Familiar rhythms echoed across seasons. The world began to feel internally consistent, even when it changed. Consistency does not require sameness, it requires pattern. Pattern had been the Earth's language all along. Ash followed eruption. Fertility followed ash, cold followed warmth. Warmth followed cold, fire followed lightning. Silence followed fire. Over and over until repetition itself became the message. Life absorbed this message not as knowledge, but as posture toward existence. Posture determines how one meets the unknown. The emerging mind met the unknown without urgency. It allowed uncertainty to exist without demanding resolution. This allowed observation to deepen. When answers are not demanded, attention can linger. Lingering attention refines perception. Perception refined itself into nuance. Small changes mattered. Subtle shifts were noticed. The world gained depth not by becoming louder, but by becoming quieter. Quiet allowed comparison. Comparison allowed discernment. Discernment allowed choice without compulsion. Choice without compulsion is freedom shaped by patience. The earth had never granted freedom directly. It had cultivated conditions where compulsion weakened, where reaction slowed, where response could be delayed long enough for memory to participate. Memory participating is reflection without narration. The mind did not narrate itself yet. It did not ask who it was. It simply recognized continuity across experiences. This recognition brought a faint sense of self, not as identity but as persistence. Persistence feels like belonging. Belonging here was not social alone, it was environmental. A sense that existence fit within a larger rhythm, that one was carried by something vast and indifferent yet reliable. The earth had given that reliability without promise. As awareness stabilized, something else occurred quietly. The future began to feel inhabitable, not predictable, not controllable, but survivable. The idea of what might come no longer triggered immediate alarm. This allowed planning to appear, not as strategy but as inclination, to gather a little extra, to wait a little longer, to move a little less hastily. Planning here was patience extended forward. The earth had been doing this since the beginning. Now life mirrored it. As this part of the final chapter settles, the resonance tightens gently. The mind, shaped by millions of years of waiting, had become capable of holding time within itself. Past, present, and possible future rested together without conflict. This was not enlightenment. It was alignment. Alignment between inner rhythm and outer process. The planet had never explained itself because explanation was unnecessary. It had shaped beings capable of living without explanation, beings who could endure uncertainty without panic, absence without despair, silence without emptiness. What remains now is not an answer, but a reflection. The earth does not remember teaching these lessons, but the lessons remain, thinking quietly, waiting patiently, carrying time forward. Inside the minds that now look out across landscapes shaped by a forgotten fire, buried ash, melted ice, and silence that once fed the ground. There is a moment so soft it cannot be located, when memory begins to feel like presence, not the presence of an object, not the presence of a sound, but the presence of continuity itself. Life, shaped by pauses longer than lifetimes, had learned how to stay with what was no longer happening. Ash had fallen and vanished. Ice had retreated. Fire had cooled into stone. Silence had fed the ground and then blended into habit. None of these remained as events. They remained as posture toward time. This posture allowed the mind to rest inside duration without strain. Waiting no longer felt like emptiness to be endured. It felt like a state that could be inhabited. The future did not press urgently. The past did not pull heavily. Both existed as gentle pressures, guiding without commanding. The earth had taught balance without instruction. In this balance, awareness did not sharpen into analysis. It softened into receptivity. The mind became a place where experience could arrive and settle without being immediately transformed. Sensation passed through memory and returned altered, slower, deeper, quieter. Quiet is not absence of activity. It is activity without urgency. The emerging mind began to experience itself not as a point moving through time, but as a span stretched across it. This span held previous moments and future possibilities together without conflict. Nothing needed to be resolved immediately. Everything could unfold. Unfolding is how the planet thinks. This realization, if it can be called that, did not feel like discovery. It felt like familiarity recognized, as though something long carried had finally been noticed. The Earth's way of enduring had become the mind's way of existing. The mind did not separate itself from the world, it mirrored it. Patterns observed outside were already present within. Cycles of attention resembled seasons. Focus sharpened and softened like light. Energy rose and fell like temperature. Memory layered like sediment. Intelligence did not stand apart from nature. It echoed it. This echo allowed a new form of calm, not safety, not certainty, calm born of alignment. When inner rhythm matched outer process, friction lessened. Life moved without rushing. It rested without fear. Fear had been transformed, not eliminated, integrated. Fear became information rather than command. It joined memory, intuition, and restraint as one voice among many. The earth had never silenced fear. It had taught life how to listen without obeying blindly. Listening without obedience is wisdom shaped by time. As this final chapter nears its closing breath, the mind no longer seeks an explanation. It no longer asks why the earth behaved as it did. It senses that explanation would add little. What mattered had already been absorbed through waiting, through loss that returned as nourishment, through cold that compressed, through fire that demanded care, through silence that fed. What the earth did not explain became the most durable inheritance of all, because explanation fades, but structure endures. And structure, when carried long enough, becomes consciousness without proclamation, awareness that does not need to announce itself to exist. The planet never intended to create minds. It simply repeated itself long enough for memory to become self-supporting. And now, as the story drifts toward its final quiet loop, the opening question returns, not to be answered, but to be held. What if the Earth once knew something, and forgot? Perhaps it never forgot. Perhaps it learned how to remember through life itself, through bodies that wait, through minds that listen, through awareness that moves gently across time, carrying forward the planet's oldest habit. To endure, to return, to remain. And somewhere beneath every thought that pauses before acting, beneath every silence that does not feel empty, the Earth continues, thinking slowly, patiently, through those who learned how to wait long enough to feel it. Then it rests. The Earth exhales. The silence closes gently around what has been said. This story has gone as far as it needs to go, not because everything was explained, but because nothing needed to be. What mattered has already settled, like ash becoming soil, like cold becoming memory, like waiting becoming thought. There is no final answer to carry away, only a rhythm that continues quietly, beneath breath, beneath pause, beneath every moment where action waits just long enough to listen. The loop is closed, the opening question has folded back into itself, not solved, held, Thank you for staying with the silence long enough to feel it change.